Hello, welcome to today's webinar. We're happy to have you here with us for this session, the Getting to Zero Market Landscape and 2020 Zero Energy Buildings List. I am Connie Empress, Communications Manager here at New Buildings Institute. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping things to tell you about. First, you are muted and we cannot hear you. This helps keep the background noise down so that everyone can better hear the speakers. I want to direct you to the dashboard that you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen. If you are having technical difficulties and cannot see the slides or hear our speakers, you can use the question pane in this dashboard to let us know, and we will help you as we go. We will take a few questions in the middle of and again at the end of the presentation. Please ask questions in the same question pane. Please take a moment to answer the survey at the end of the webinar. We consider your input in the planning of future sessions. If you are seeking AIA credits, the survey is where you will share your AIA number for credit submission. This session is being recorded. All registrants will receive an email tomorrow with links to the recording and slides for this presentation. If you need a certificate of attendance for your records, it will also be part of tomorrow's follow-up. I want to introduce you to my colleague, Alexi Miller, Associate Director here at NBI. Alexi has spent more than a decade working to transform the built environment through energy efficiency programs, best practices guidance, and policy development. Alexi, over to you.
Thank you, Connie. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Happy to have you here. Virtual as it may be, we're all glad you're on. I want to take a moment here to introduce our panelists. Actually, let me take a moment to introduce NBI just very briefly. Thanks. So New Buildings Institute is a nonprofit organization. We've been around for 20 plus years, and we are working with, there we go, sorry. We're working with increased urgency to address carbon emissions in the built environment and to some extent now beyond, really focusing on improving energy performance in new and existing buildings. So one of the key ways in which we work has to do with advancing the market and the technologies and the implementation through policy and otherwise of zero energy buildings and zero carbon buildings. It's one of our core focus areas. It's something we've been really working on for a long time. And so I'm excited to be able to talk about this topic in more depth with you all today. I want to take a moment to introduce our panelists. First of all, there's me, so hello. We have Kevin Carbonnier, who's a project manager here at NBI. Kevin's focused on technical research and data analysis. He specializes in building energy analysis, zero energy market tracking, grid interactivity metrics, and carbon accounting. Kevin and I will talk a lot about in the first half here about kind of the zero energy buildings market and some of the key trends. Next, we'll go to Catherine Wright, who joined the Urban Sustainability Directors Network in February as the program's director for buildings. She manages the network's building energy program and the Zero Cities project, a collaboration across 11 cities focused on centering equity in their building decarbonization strategies. We'll hear from Michelle Amt, who has 20 years of international experience overseeing a wide range of projects focused on sustainable design. As VMDO's Director of Sustainability, Michelle facilitates design dialogue, leads research and educational efforts, and helps teams achieve sustainability goals across all projects. And we'll go to Dan Ahrens, who's a principal of Perkins Eastman. Is a recognized leader with 30 years of experience in sustainable design and building technology. Dan's an architect and a placemaker for academic buildings and campuses and supports and enhances academic missions with an integrative approach to planning, programming, and design. And last but not least, by any means, we'll hear from Daryl Boyce, who was ASHRAE's president for the 2019-2020 term. So we're very honored to have Daryl joining us. Daryl previously served on the board of directors as treasurer, vice president, and director at large. He's the recipient of ASHRAE's Distinguished Service Award, Exceptional Service Award, and the Regional Award of Merit. Thanks. And Kevin, I'll run the slide for a bit here. So a bit about today's agenda. We're going to start with an overview of some getting to zero insights and look at zero energy and zero carbon building trends and some key progress areas in there. That'll be Kevin and myself bouncing back and forth. on that. And then Catherine's going to give us a rundown on some of the key ZE policy trends that are both advancing the market and is shaping how zero energy buildings roll out in the world. We're going to pause in the middle there for some clarifying questions. So if you have questions, throw them into the chat, and we'll pull them out and answer them in that midpoint if they're clarifying questions. And then we'll go to 3 case studies from Michelle, Dan, and Daryl, each about 10 minutes long, and then we'll pause at the very end for both clarifying and broader, more discussion-focused questions. So if you put a question in the chat about the first half and we didn't get to it in that first section, it might be because we want to talk about it with all of us. But we do welcome all your questions. Thanks. So let's start with a little bit of kind of level setting to determine what do we mean when we say a zero energy building. There are quite a few names out there, zero energy, zero carbon, all kinds of interesting variations. On our list, we use zero energy, verified, certified, and emerging. But there's really a name game here. You've probably heard of zero net energy buildings and net zero energy buildings and carbon neutral buildings and near zero or zero ready. There are certifications like living building, passive house, zero, LEED zero, all kinds of interesting stuff. I kind of see all these different angles, and they're each valid in their own way and important. I kind of see them all as something of a filter, because what I want to get out of thinking about what's happening in the zero energy building market and the zero carbon building market is what are the best, most trailblazing, highest efficiency, highest performing buildings out there. So we're using these as a bit of a filter. We talk about zero energy buildings in this. We're going to use that today in this webinar and in our graphics. And we're talking about kind of 3 tiers, if you will: emerging, verified, and certified. So a little more clarity on those. First of all, we often talk about projects. We'll use it somewhat interchangeably with buildings, but that means a zero energy building, or maybe a district or a campus or even a portfolio of buildings that is both highly efficient and meets 100% of its annual energy needs with renewables. Like I said, we've got 3 tiers: emerging, verified, certified. Emerging means that building or that project is trying to get to zero. They've made a public statement saying we're going to get to zero energy. Maybe they're in planning or design, still building it. They've only been around for 6 months, so they don't have a year's worth of data, or maybe they just haven't gotten there yet. There's all kinds of issues that delay that, and maybe we just don't know about that data. That happens, I'm sure, more than I wish, but it happens a lot. Verified projects are those that we have seen the data of at least a year's worth of performance of energy production and consumption, and we can say confidently, yes, this building made it to zero. And then certified, kind of a subset of verified, these are these leading buildings that not only have made it to zero, but have also gotten certification from a trusted third party, like International Living Future Institute, with a couple different certifications that they have, or US Green Building Council, for example, with LEED Zero. We're also going to talk about energy performance. So we're going to use the phrase EUI, that's energy use intensity, site kBTU per square foot per year. That's a pretty typical metric. And the reason we focus on that is because efficiency, load reduction and efficiency are fundamental to getting to zero. So we've been tracking these things for some time. We started back in 2012 with a status report on zero energy buildings. At that time, there were 60 buildings, 60. We've put another report out every couple years. 2014, we had 160. 2016, we were up to 330. 2018, almost 500. 2019, 580. Now we are just shy of 700 buildings or projects on our list, which is exciting. What you see there is the 2020 Getting to Zero Buildings list. That's actually a document that we're going to be releasing on Monday. And you can see this growth chart. It's really exciting to see the fast growth in zero energy buildings ramping up. My hope is that we work ourselves out of a job and it becomes impossible to track the number of zero energy buildings that are out there. So I'd love to see this number keep on climbing. And we'll tell you kind of what's going on in that market. That's our national list. We also put out regionally specific watch lists, several for California over the years, Northwest. We've done sector specific, like the Zero Energy Schools watch list. New York status report, lots of good stuff in there. If you're in New York, I highly recommend checking that one out. And of course, last year's list. We're also just about to come out pretty soon here with a Midwest zero energy project list, which is exciting to be able to announce that. So hopefully you'll see that soon. Zero energy projects are all across North America. There are projects in, Kevin can remind me, I believe it's 45 states and 5 Canadian provinces. There are projects all over the country in every major climate zone, all the way up to climate zone 8. So everywhere from Miami, Florida to the far north, you can find a zero energy project, and across many different sectors. Kevin?
Thanks, Alexi. Here's another look at that same data set of where these zero energy buildings are in this multitude of states, as Alexi mentioned. I'll pose one challenge here to our listeners. We know that California has the most projects and has been ahead in many respects in this field, but California is also, has the largest population. And so I want to put in the back of your mind a little challenge to see which state here actually has the most zero energy buildings per capita, because California is not the leader in that respect. So just to give a little more context there. We've broken down this graphic by regional energy efficiency organizations, and that's those colors that you see there, just to give you a little bit of a regional breakdown. And so we see pretty healthy mix throughout these different regions of having zero energy buildings, with California standing alone with the highest number as we expect. But we've seen growth in other areas as well, particularly in the Pacific Northwest and in the Northeast regions. And so, as Alexi mentioned, zero energy buildings are highly efficient, and that's by design. We want buildings to be efficient first, because that reduces your impact on the electric grid, that reduces your need for renewable energy, and that just overall reduces the amount of operational energy that you need, and reduces the building's environmental impact. And so we could see here, based on our data set, the verified and emerging buildings in green and blue, which is a color scheme we'll see throughout this presentation, so keep that in mind. Our median EUI is around 20 to 24, which compared to national benchmarks like CBEX or REX, which is a residential energy consumption survey, where these ZEE buildings use about half the energy of those comparable buildings from around the 2012 to 2015 date range. And Alexi is going to tell us about the building sizes and trends there.
Yeah, so when we first saw zero energy buildings come in, maybe 10 years or more ago, it was mostly small demonstration projects, maybe at colleges or nonprofit offices, things along those lines mostly. And they were pretty little, right? 5, 10, 20,000 square foot buildings. And so for a while there, the first projects that got verified were quite small. It's encouraging that we are now seeing larger projects get not only built and be emerging, but come into that verified and that certified category. So now we're seeing more big buildings, in the 100,000s of square feet range, actually make it into the verified range. So that's a sign of exciting progress.
And as Alexi mentioned, we started with some offices, some demonstration projects, but now we've seen zero energy buildings expand to over 100 distinct types. A lot of those can consolidate into education and office, which make up more than half the list. And the education category is pretty broad, so we've actually included a breakdown in the bottom piece of this graphic here. And you can see about half of those education buildings are actually K through 12 schools, which is a really important market for NBI and for the zero energy movement, as these are long-term owners with capacity to really focus on zero energy as a benefit to students for education and as an energy benefit to get good paybacks and make the economic case for the residents in the school district or wherever the school may be. So some growth that we've seen recently over the past several years is in the multifamily space. We don't have too many verified projects there yet because a lot of these projects are relatively new, but that's probably the largest growth that we've seen in the building type space.
And zero energy buildings from the get-go have been pretty evenly split generally between public and private. The who's in the lead can change a tiny bit here and there, but we've seen not only growth in the public sector from driven in large part by policy. Say the state of California has said all our new buildings are going to be zero energy, and we're going to retrofit our existing buildings to get there too. So that drives a lot of progress, right? When a big jurisdiction like that says we're doing this zero energy thing. Cities and states around the country have made these kind of commitments, and Catherine's going to be talking a bit about that in a bit here. But it's encouraging to note that we've also seen progress in the private sector. So what you're seeing on this chart here, don't worry too much about the minor difference here in 2020 because these things are, there's some noise in the picture. But we're seeing growth in both public and private. The picture you see on the right there is the Richardsville Elementary out in Kentucky. And there's actually been some really exciting progress in the school sector in Kentucky, which you may not have realized was a zero energy leader, but they are. So good to see both public and private sector growth.
So just to summarize the trends that we've seen, we know that zero energy buildings are found all across North America, both in the diversity of states. We actually have 46 states plus DC and 5 provinces, and in the diversity of climate zones. So we have all the way from San Diego to Quebec and all the way from Miami to Alaska.
We've seen an exciting growth in scale of with some buildings and owners taking their zero energy approach, not only at the building level, but moving it up to whole zero energy districts, or saying we're going to get our whole portfolio or campus up to zero. And that's making some interesting changes too in how renewables come into the picture. Used to be they were all PV on the roof only, or maybe on some parking garages. But now when you're talking about getting an entire university campus or state buildings across the state of California to zero, now you're seeing some interesting combinations of maybe on-site and off-site renewables or centralized renewables or kind of new structures there.
And beyond just the physical scope of zero energy buildings, we're actually seeing a trend to increase the scope of the emissions and going beyond energy. So now we've got zero carbon certifications coming up, which Alexi will talk about in a bit. And we also see expanding to include things like maybe transportation, embodied carbon, refrigerants. So we're really seeing pushing the envelope beyond just zero energy operationally at the site.
And as project owners focus on expanding their thinking beyond zero energy at the site, we're starting to see increased focus on trends like decarbonization and electrification of building loads, on enhanced building grid integration to make sure that buildings are helping enable the transition to a fully sustainable and decarbonized electricity grid by thinking about when they use energy and how flexible they can be with energy as well. So we're seeing these kind of complementary trends of more buildings targeting zero in sectors and regions all across the country, maybe doing so in some interesting ways, like at the district or the campus level or the portfolio level, seeing that focus expand, and we're seeing projects start to think about these complementary impacts of their buildings. Kevin mentioned a moment ago that we'll talk a little bit about zero carbon certifications, and I think this is actually a really interesting growth area. The purpose to many people of building a zero energy building has a lot to do with greenhouse gas emissions, carbon. And so now you're seeing certifications come onto the market that focus specifically on achieving zero carbon. The International Living Future Institute has the zero carbon certification. US Green Building Council has their LEED Zero carbon option. And there are some other zero carbon specs out there in the world. We actually reviewed more than a dozen of them, and we came to the conclusion that there's quite a bit of variability in the market right now in the zero carbon definitions game, if you will. around what exactly is a zero carbon building. We all agree that it's got something in common with a zero energy building, but zero energy is not necessarily the same thing as zero carbon. Offsetting your renewable energy or offsetting your energy use through renewables, some hours of the year have higher carbon intensity than other hours. Some regions have higher grid carbon intensity than other regions, right? The grid is dirtier in one place than another across the country, and during peak times tends to be dirtier than off-peak times in many cases. So we know they're not quite the same thing, and it's interesting to see that there's significant variability between these certifications on things like what is the role of efficiency? Is there a minimum efficiency floor to get into to be called a zero carbon building? Can you burn gas on site or other fuels? What about how you treat offsite renewables? How do we define the quality requirements to make sure that if you're using offsite renewables that they have additionality, that they're good and legit, et cetera? And what do we include and what do we exclude? Embodied carbon, transportation, electric vehicle charging, all kinds of stuff like that. So the point is that there's a fair bit of variability out there in the market. NBI is working with several other leaders in the built environment through a group called Collective Impact, and we're trying to come to some agreements on this. At least, we want to agree on the basic foundations of this, so that even if we're not all on the same page, we're all reading out of the same book, and that will help achieve some consistency and hopefully advance the zero carbon buildings market in a cohesive way.
And one way to get to these zero energy and zero carbon buildings is through these technologies. And based on our database, we've pulled out some of the common technologies that we see in these buildings as a way to kind of show the market, these are what people, as we will see in our case studies, what our leading designers are doing. And so I'll just quickly highlight a few of these. You'll have the slides so you can look at these in more detail. But one big emerging piece is heat pumps for both space and water heating. There's a lot of development right now in heat pump water heaters to expand the scope of those and where they're viable. Ventilation, in some cases, we see a lot of natural ventilation where the climate is, where the climate is good enough to do that, particularly in California, we see that. And we see a lot of dedicated outdoor air systems to decouple the ventilation and the space load in these buildings. Other big ones are radiant heating and cooling. That's very common in these zero energy buildings, but not common throughout the building stock. And then lastly, we have plug load controls, which is also not very common in the building stock, but we see this in almost every zero energy building to have things like automatic shutoffs for different outlets during unoccupied hours, for example.
So there are some interesting emerging technologies coming out that we're starting to see more in zero energy buildings. Heat pump water heaters are a foundational technology to decarbonizing buildings and are being used more and more in zero energy buildings. We're also seeing more buildings, especially multifamily, using central heat pump water heaters. And it's really exciting to see that there's good movement toward deployment of 120 volt heat pump water heaters, which is going to be a really important technology for retrofitting onto existing buildings, so that you don't have to deal with rewiring if you want to put an electric heat pump water heater where a gas water heater used to be. We're also seeing some movements in equipment and in products toward lower global warming potential. That's GWP refrigerants. Current refrigerants, if they leak out, they tend to be pretty hard on the climate. They're potent greenhouse gases. But we're seeing some interesting new products coming out with lower GWP options and even natural refrigerants like CO2 or propane that are very, very low GWP. In California, there's going to be, in 2023, many HVAC products are going to be required to shift to lower GWP options, GWP less than 750, which you might call mid global warming potential. So that's coming up in California 2023, in Washington 2024. It's coming elsewhere in other timeframes. So that's an interesting shift we're seeing. And as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing more focus on building grid interactions, and that can be done through controls like those energy management systems that's shown there. It can also be done through deployment of thermal energy storage, hot water or ice, and it can be done through batteries. And we're seeing good, it's good to see, we could probably use some more, but we're seeing attention paid to how to co-optimize the deployment of systems like energy storage, whether thermal or battery, how to co-optimize it to achieve both cost and carbon savings.
And aside from those, we have advanced envelopes. So this is really pioneered by Passive House in limiting thermal bridging through your building envelope. I know there's some challenges in getting modeling there, but there's really been a trend to get the envelope as tight and as efficient as possible and use energy recovery to ventilate your building there. We have automated shading controls as a new emerging technology. So these are shades that can automatically respond to control for glare and maximize daylight penetration into the space so that you can get both thermal benefits and daylighting benefits that allow you to save on lighting energy and improve occupant well-being, which are often coupled with these advanced lighting control systems where we have networked lighting with luminaire level lighting controls so that you can actually have lights dim to the occupant's preference or actually come off if there's no occupants in that particular space automatically. And all that comes together with multi-end use integrated controls. So these are having your building management system control more and more of the building down to more granular levels. And then lastly, this is a really big topic, but just to mention it quickly here, we have lower embodied carbon materials. And so there's some new tools on the market, like one that's called EC3 or Tally, to take a quick look and improve your material selection to reduce your embodied carbon in your building. Mostly we're focused on operational carbon and zero energy, but as we mentioned, that scope is expanding. So things like your cement ratio in your concrete and other materials can really have a pretty large impact with little or no cost on your total carbon footprint of your building.
So I just wanted to take a quick moment to do a technology spotlight. As I said a moment ago, heat pump water heaters are a critical technology toward that are being used in more and more zero energy buildings and in more non-zero energy buildings all over the country. Heat pump water heaters, they've been around for decades, well-proven technology, but they're really starting to take off now. The efficiencies tend to be maybe 2 to 4 times more efficient than a conventional either electric resistance or gas fired water heater. And that in turn delivers pretty substantial energy and lifetime cost savings over the course of the lifetime of the water heater, which comes of course with really significant reductions in terms of emissions on site if you're talking about gas, and power plant if you're talking about electric resistance heaters. You know, we've been running the Advanced Water Heating Initiative for a bit now, and it's really bearing fruit. Some of the work that's coming out of that, for example, the 120 volt heat pump water heater, we're really trying to accelerate the deployment of these technologies, central water heaters, 120 volt unitary, a couple different technology options to try to get as many of these out there as we can. There are lower GWP refrigerant options coming out right now, but that is not to say that we shouldn't be putting today's heat pump water heaters in buildings right now. The picture there is actually a unit that I installed in my mother-in-law's basement just down the street over the summer. Took me a couple hours on a weekend afternoon, and she loves it. She calls it her rocket ship, and she says that her bills have demonstrably gone down since it was put in. And thanks to some great incentives from our local utility company, that cost $225 delivered. So that was amazing. So that went really well, and I'd love to see more of those in zero energy and in non-zero energy buildings all around the country. So just to wrap it up a little bit, these are what we call the 5 foundations of zero carbon building policy, and increasingly we are seeing these reflected in zero carbon buildings, those that we track. So for example, let me just run through very briefly. Energy efficiency remains fundamental. Reducing loads and installing highly efficient equipment is a foundational component of getting to zero. Renewable energy obviously is a critical piece, right? Balancing that energy consumption with on-site renewables, and there's some evolving some evolving approaches to renewables, especially when you get to the portfolio level. More buildings are thinking about building grid integration or incorporating energy storage, thermal and battery both. We're seeing a big push toward building electrification, toward taking out gas in buildings and putting in highly efficient electric options like heat pump water heaters. And finally, we're seeing some focus not only in policy, but also in buildings on embodied carbon. We maintain a database that tracks all the zero energy buildings across North America. It's called the Getting to Zero Buildings Database. And Kevin's gonna give you a little rundown on that tool.
Yeah, just to really quickly bring this to everyone's attention in case you're not aware of it, on our website, you can actually see a live interactive buildings database. So a lot of the data that we showed here is available online. Here's the link at the top when you get the slides, or you can just search for this in your browser to get there. Some things you can do with the database are filter by region. So for example, here we filtered just to New York, just so you can kind of see what's in your neighborhood and see what the leading projects are, so that you can see what other people are doing in your climate zone and in your region. Aside from the map, we actually have a little bit of analysis available as well with the same filtering capability with those checkboxes on the left side there. So a lot of the stuff you see here should be familiar to what we've presented. So you can actually go in and tinker it and see how things break down in your area as well. So we encourage everyone to use this. We see these graphics and slides pretty often. So we just do ask that you properly credit New Buildings Institute. Here's a citation for you to get you started as well.
Yeah, so now that you've put a building out there, let's be sure that we are tracking it. There's a project registry that we've put together. So if you do poke around in the Getting to Zero database and you don't see your project in there, let's put it in there. Let's give you the credit you deserve. So now I'd like to pass it over to Catherine Wright to give us an overview of some key policy trends that we should be thinking about in this space. Catherine?
Hi, everyone. Let's see if I can get this slide to advance here. Okay, great. So hi, everybody. My name is Catherine Wright. I'm the Program Director for Buildings over at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. We call ourselves USDN for short. I'll be speaking briefly about some emerging trends in building energy policy that we're observing throughout local governments. So I just would like to start by thanking Alexi and Kevin for sharing the database and queuing up a lot of the trends and themes that I'll be discussing in my brief talk. If you are not familiar with USDN, we're a peer network of just over 220 cities and counties across North America, working on climate change mitigation, adaptation, and energy system transformation. We also have a sister organization, the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance, and that includes a lot of the climate vanguard cities in the US and abroad. So just to start, we have a lot of active projects in the network at a moment, and I think this slide in and of itself provides a bit of a snapshot about the policy direction and where a lot of the cities and counties that are active on this topic are thinking about the built environment. Since we're a peer network, we have a lot of groups that are focused on learning about emerging topics, but we also fund a lot of innovation projects for policies that are emergent. Right now, some emergent topics that a lot of our members are looking at are embodied carbon policies and thinking about building performance standards, which I'll talk about a little bit later. We also have action groups for our cities that are actively in pursuit of policies which are a little bit more established, like benchmarking and audit policies here, as well as opportunities for cities to dive into more in-depth work in the built environment. So part of the reason that we focus so much on the built environment and USDN is because our cities and counties have set very ambitious carbon reduction targets. This slide shows a snapshot of the emission reductions ambitions for the cities in the Carbon Neutral Cities Alliance. This graphic is a few years old, and now there are many more cities who've set ambitious reduction targets in the range of 80% by 2050 and beyond, and also aggressive targets for the next 10 years by 2030. And so cities are increasingly moving from thinking about climate planning towards really thinking about in-depth implementation so they can actually meet these goals successfully. And what happens when local governments unpack their goals and try to understand how they can reach these targets is that buildings are a big part of that. And when they examine what they have direct jurisdictional authority over, often energy efficiency and thinking about building development through zoning and codes are areas where a lot of cities and counties have more direct jurisdictional authority as opposed to shared authority with the state or regional government. And that's not to say that this still isn't hard work and that many cities aren't working in partnership with utilities who run energy efficiency programs as well. It just does illustrate that there is sometimes a more straightforward path for cities to work on decarbonization in the built environment, and why the topic is of interest to cities and counties, and why it's always been a focus of our network. So given this, what's changed and what's emerging given this context? So as I mentioned, building energy was one of the first areas USDN has focused on since we started as a network. Thus, we've been helping local governments think about building policies for a long time. This began with early benchmarking and disclosure policies. And I would note that while there are a lot of cities that have benchmarking policies now, there are still many more communities out there who are interested in standing up their own benchmarking policies. So that's still an active area of exploration. As cities began examining their benchmarking data, though, those that had access to benchmarking data, many of them realized that the emissions reductions and market transformation of the built environment that they were seeing through benchmarking alone was just not going to cut it to reach some of those goals that I showed before. So increasingly, a lot of cities and counties are looking to policies that go beyond transparency and disclosure towards advancing specific actions and emission reductions in existing buildings and new construction. So I'll spend most of the remainder of my time talking a little bit about what we're starting to see. I also want to note that many of the examples are drawn from our Zero Cities project, which is a project that we actually worked on with New Buildings Institute. This was a collaboration of 11 cities and community organizations that were working on transforming the built environment through decarbonization while also lifting up social equity. This project concludes this year, but many of the policy and programmatic efforts that emerged through this group of cities, I think, are also representative of some of the trends that we are seeing more broadly. So I'll start with some of the trends we're noticing in existing buildings. So even outside of this year and before 2020, a lot of our members in particular were beginning to think about how social context and equity interacts with the built environment. The current social context and the pandemic have just accelerated and put a greater focus on thinking about inequities in investment in the health, efficiency, and performance of our building stock. Unfortunately, these existing inequities that we're noticing have a historical basis. So what I'm showing here on this slide is a redlining map of Portland, which is publicly available. And for those of you unfamiliar with the history of redlining, it essentially was a process for rating areas for receipt of investment, and grades on this slide were largely tied to the race of the inhabitants of a given area. And unfortunately, when we pull back and look at this legacy of disinvestment, this is also sort of mapping to our current building stock and sort of where there is still disinvestment now in a lot of our communities. So many of our members are starting to look at where the most underserved populations are and some of the most under-resourced buildings as a way to focus their policy efforts. So Portland began an in-depth dialogue with their community through the Zero Cities project. And they did a dialogue with their community to both increase their capacity to understand a little bit more about the built environment in Portland, and also to help them prioritize how they should be spending their time. So through the Zero Cities project, we developed an equity assessment tool, and it was designed to help cities and communities work in partnership to identify the largest challenges and barriers impacting local built environments. That list of factors is on the right, and I think it's actually fairly representative of a lot of what we're seeing in our cities in terms of areas to think about. Portland and their community partner, Verde, went through a series of dialogues, and the community lifted up that they were very concerned about energy burden and gentrification. The result of those dialogues was pushing for rental energy efficiency standards as a policy method of improving the city's worst buildings first. And I would note that this was a shift in how they were thinking about their building policy, which had previously been focused around new construction and large commercial buildings. And the community redirected some of those near-term efforts. So many of our members in USDN are also trying to think about how to address energy burden and make health improvements in partnership with community. And we're likely to see this trend continue, especially in light of the pandemic. So it is something that I wanted to lift up first. Another piece of the existing buildings is really talking about ensuring performance. So as I alluded to earlier, cities are really trying to push beyond benchmarking and transparency towards action, so they have more certainty that they will reach their emissions goal. So one method of doing this is a growing interest in building performance standards and other beyond benchmarking policies. So at one level, some communities like Seattle and Philadelphia have begun tune-up policies that are focused on quick payback energy retrofits that are identified by regular audits of their building stock in their city. This can drive savings beyond what you might see with the benchmarking ordinance. Some cities are moving towards more stringent requirements, which require an accelerated retrofit and renovation cycle in the community. And this is done through a policy that we call building performance standards. So 3 of these have been passed currently in the US. New York City, Washington, DC, and St. Louis all now have some form of building performance policy. St. Louis and Washington, DC use an energy-based standard, which calls for specific EUI targets for existing buildings to hit over time, driving towards those very deep carbon reductions that I showed in the earlier slide. New York City, under Local Law 97, is taking a more direct emissions-based approach by actually regulating the amount of carbon emissions that are allowed to come from a particular building over time. There are more local governments than the 3 I named that are exploring performance standards. And besides the policy themselves, they're also trying to think about what support mechanisms are necessary for these policies to succeed, which looks like incentives and financing and different types of support for private developers in these cities. And they're also trying to think about how energy can be advanced alongside health and resilience through these standards. And while the existing building stock contributes to the majority of emissions in local governments, our members are also thinking about new construction. As you can see on the slide, which is an MBI blog post, cities have become very interested in codes as a method to guarantee emissions reductions from future buildings and new constructions. And many cities were actively engaged in the 2021 IECC process to help ensure the code contained efficiency gains aligned with their goals. Since many of the national code changes end up as the basis for local stretch code and local government adoption, it's becoming increasingly important to ensure that the code contains strong efficiency gains in order for cities to be successful with their climate goals. If you are following the codes process very closely like I was, and maybe you're just a nerd like I know I am, there was an electrification ready provision in the proposed code. And that's broadly in alignment with what we're seeing, which is broad interest across the country and learning more about electrification as a decarbonization strategy. So this map reflects who we are aware of in terms of cities and counties in different states that are interested in exploring electrification. We've noticed this in terms of a growth in group purchase programs and incentive policies at the local level that are really targeted at driving some of those technological investments that were alluded to by Alexi and Kevin in the previous presentation. And we're also seeing encouragement of electrification through all electric stretch and zoning codes. So for example, there was a recent code put out in Santa Monica that really is pushing for all electric. And there's also in a parallel to the interest in electrification, there has been growing interest in prohibitions and restrictions on new natural gas connections. There's been very public conversations about this in California and Massachusetts. And increasingly, those discussions regarding the future of natural gas are occurring at the state level. We're aware of at least 11 state legislatures actively discussing this concept. And so many communities are starting to look towards state regulatory agencies as well as state level work as where they might want to continue to engage in the future on electrification. So hopefully this provides a helpful snapshot of how we are seeing some emerging policies at the local government level. There are obvious emerging complexities that we're just beginning to understand and plan for. These include, how is the real estate market going to change in light of COVID and everyone working from home? How do we best integrate health and resilience into how we think about retrofits? And how does the ongoing national conversation about social equity fit into climate planning? So I'd say if you'd like to learn more about how cities are approaching work in the built environment, you can take a look at our Zero Cities project page. We just released a project reflections document of the project to date, which might be a little bit helpful and provide more of a snapshot into how cities are working with community to advance high performance buildings across the country. So thanks, and I will turn it back over to MBI.
Thank you, Catherine, for that. Lots of info in that content. That was really interesting and encouraging. That's a good progress. Do we have questions popping in through the chat, or shall we proceed to the next set?
Well, we don't have any specific questions on Catherine's section, but Kevin really piqued the interest of our audience and everybody wants to know who is the per capita leader on zero energy buildings.
Right.
Kevin?
Yeah, so actually Vermont, and then Oregon is next. I think California comes in third or fourth. But yeah,
Excellent.
Vermont is the winner there.
Thanks, Kevin.
That confirms that you can do it in cold climates.
Right.
That's for sure.
So we did have one question come up for Catherine here before we move forward. And it is grid interactivity part of what is happening with codes?
So that's an interesting question. So I know a lot of our members are beginning to think about grid interactivity in buildings. In the provisions that I'm aware of that our members had a lot of support over, I don't recall anything particularly around grid interactivity, though there was a lot of support for the electrification and EV ready provisions, which in and of themselves have implication for potential future demand management programs. I don't know, MBI team, if you're aware of any of the provisions were grid interactive specific, because I know that's a research area of y'all's.
Yeah, there are some provisions in the 2021 IECC that relate to this topic. Like Catherine was saying, you know, solar ready and now solar plus storage ready. The idea there, the idea of the storage is not only resiliency, but also grid support and time of use carbon capabilities to modify load shapes when buildings demand energy over hours to reduce carbon that way. So there are a couple of code provisions. You know, I think a lot of the progress on building grid integration is more coming at the program level, like utility programs and also voluntary programs. We're leading the Grid Optimal Buildings Initiative, which is all about building grid integration. At the core of Grid Optimal is the development of new metrics to measure the quality of building grid integration, right? To be able to put a number on how a building interacts with the grid around it in various different categories. So we've developed those metrics, we've published them, we've got a white paper on it that came out in the this summer's 2020 ACEEE summer study proceedings. We've got a blog about those metrics, and you know, excitingly, we are making progress on a LEED pilot credit. It's a alternative compliance pathway for the grid harmonization credit. So if we've got preliminary progress on that draft and first round of approvals. So now we're moving through the process there, and pretty soon here you should be able to get LEED points based on your performance measured, your building grid integration performance measured through these building grid interaction metrics on ComEd. There's also utility programs that are moving forward. But of course, you've got different approaches in different utility programs, and we expect that some of them will be using grid optimal metrics. Some of them might look more like traditional demand response programs. Very briefly, though, on codes, you know, Title 24, 2022 will have some building grid integration measures. The International Green Conservation Code, IGCC, and ASHRAE Standard 189.1 also cover the topic to some extent. So it pops up a few places in codes, and I think you're going to see it more and more in utility and voluntary programs.
Yeah, I would note on the utility side that I know that, like, for instance, in the latest round of the Massachusetts 3-year energy efficiency plans, there is now an active demand target that was part of their performance requirements under the energy efficiency program, and it was the first time that had been introduced. So I think there's definitely going to be a lot more activity in that particular realm.
And we're going to need it more and more as the grid decarbonizes. Buildings have a critical role. We can either use buildings can either enable grid decarbonization or can really stand in the way. So it's an important area. It's exciting to see the progress being made.
So Alexi, we have had quite a few questions come in since the prompt, but I think we should move forward with our case studies and try to hit some of these at the end and follow up individually with some of the more very specific questions we're getting through the question pane. So thanks for your patience, everyone. We can move forward.
Great. So let's move to some case studies and get specific here. Not that we haven't been specific, but let's zoom in a little. We are going to begin with, oh, you know what, Kevin, you have the keyboard and mouse. That's great. Go for it. And Michelle, off you go.
All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience, VMDO architects, in the DC area. VMDO has nearly 400,000 square feet of net zero building in operation or under construction in about a 10-mile radius. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about what we've experienced in the transformation of this Nova market around net zero. And for us, the journey started in 2012 with Discovery Elementary School. Importantly, around that time, as we mentioned, as Alexi mentioned earlier, there weren't a lot of net zero buildings around, definitely not verified net zero buildings. Richardsville Elementary School and Locust Trace High School in Kentucky, both by CMTA engineers, were kind of the larger size projects. They were over 50,000 square feet, and they were of the same typologies, schools, and in the same general climate zone. And they were good models for us to look to when we won Discovery, to say, well, you know, let's do something different. We've done a lot of sustainability focused schools, but not one that had been zero energy. So we partnered with CMTA, went to the client and said, hey, we're a new team, but we really want to try this thing. And the most important thing that happened was the client said, sure, go ahead and try it. Don't spend any more money, but you're more than welcome to explore it. And so that as that project was ongoing, Arlington released its 2013 Community Energy Plan. And it had this great little blurb in it, like, it may be possible to generate more energy from renewable sources than a building might use. So there was this tentative, you know, the concept of it out there, but it was thought of as a demonstration, expensive thing to do. Discovery opened in 2015 and used a lot of the technologies that were mentioned before: geothermal, HVAC, right sizing equipment, demand control ventilation, all state-of-the-shelf stuff that was integrated in a way that produced zero energy. And zero energy was a driving force in the design. So we had good data on it. It was verified zero energy pretty quickly afterward. For the capital investment, we came in $2 million under budget, even with the PV array. And the annual cost of ownership of Discovery is less than a tenth of other schools for Arlington. So it was a pretty successful model. And so that success allowed us to, even before the project was open, we were able to secure Fleet Elementary School. And that opened in 2019. This time the PV array was as a PPA. It's on a, you can see it's on a tight, complicated site. It's 4 stories. Uses a lot of the same technologies that Discovery did. We took some lessons learned from Discovery and pulled them into Fleet. We changed the exterior envelope construction because Discovery was ICF construction, and that was a little bit challenging this market. So this moved over to spray foam. And shortly after we sort of got through DDs in Fleet, our athletics and community design studio won the Lubber Run Community Center in Arlington. So this was an important milestone for the firm, in that this was, even though it was within the same municipality, they were different client groups, and the Lubber Run Parks and Rec was not particularly, they were interested in exploring net zero, but it wasn't a requirement for the project, and they were a little bit nervous. So we spent a lot of time educating the client, taking them to Discovery and touring it, having them talk with colleagues over in public schools to help get that sense of this is something achievable, and it was important, and it was verified, and it was easy to operate, and could come in at a normal budget and not to worry, so that by the time the team and the owner made the go, no go decision on net zero, everybody had already bought in. Lubber opens, it's waiting on its certificate of occupancy. It'll open in 2021 because of the pandemic, and the PDs are also via PPA. It has a lot of the same systems, same team. And from there, we won shortly after, as Lubber was exploring net zero and that client education was happening. Reed Elementary School was another net zero school for Arlington Public Schools. And it is a renovation addition, 4 stories again, weird tight site again. Opening in 2021, again, uses a lot of the same technologies and approaches. So as we look at, so these are 4 projects that are going on. As we look at the kind of larger context, Arlington Public Schools did a solar PPA agreement for 5 of its schools at the end of 2018. And in 2019, they released a facility sustainability policy. So within that, there's this little blurb, and it says that all county buildings should be net zero energy ready. So they went from, in 2013, it might be possible, to requiring all the public buildings to be zero energy ready within 6 years. And this is a screen grab of the Arlington Public Schools RFP language. So in addition to just saying zero energy, they now have these performance criteria for their schools. So EUI, air tightness, that type of thing. A lot of the same things that were mentioned as approaches earlier. And if we look at the evolution of the RFP language, from 2012, Discovery's LEED silver minimum, LEED 2009 silver minimum, and nothing in zero energy, to 2017 silver minimum under V4 and zero energy requirement plus all of these specific targets, EUI, envelope, HVAC. So that's a 5-year span for such a revolution. And then in the 2019 Community Energy Plan, which was released, updated the 2013 plan, it now cites Discovery and Fleet as evidence of net zero energy development and commits the county to demonstrating net zero concept scale. So it's quite a sea change in 6 years. But what's most interesting to us is how this has become a regional dialogue. So in 2016, the DOE Zero Energy Schools Accelerator launched at Discovery for everybody to share best practices around getting to zero energy in schools. And in 2019, the DMV Net Zero Building Coalition launch happened. And this is, again, that Maryland, DC, Northern Virginia discussion around how to move more quickly and share best practices. In 2018, as Catherine mentioned, the Clean Energy DC Omnibus Act happened, and the HICC-HOCOL's American Geophysical Union just opened in this year. And that's a net zero retrofit. So in that context, net zero as within the dialogue happening in the area, it's becoming more and more common. So the Omnibus Act has a requirement for a net zero energy retrofit program across 12% of the DGS portfolio. Clean Energy DC has these the district targets, but also in their action areas, 10% is constructing net buildings, new net zero buildings. So you can see, like, this net zero ethos is permeating DC, and a lot of that points back to the successes within the area, including Arlington and its evolution over those 5 years. And then, so most recently, we have a net zero energy community center, Stead Park, that's under design right now. And it's opening in 2022. This is a screen grab of its current design. So if I had to, from what we witnessed in the market, the keys to transforming markets, the first would be developing a long-term relationship with key decision makers. So that first leap of faith that with Discovery Elementary happened because we had a very good relationship with our client at Arlington Public Schools. So you have to have somebody that's willing to trust you to try new things. The second is to demonstrate that zero energy ready can be done within current construction budgets. It doesn't have to be an ad anymore. It can be accomplished with today's technology and today's budgets. Third is leveraging successful projects and happy clients. If we hadn't been able to direct our Arlington clients to the successful projects in Kentucky, it wouldn't have happened. In addition, Lumber Run probably wouldn't have been as smooth a decision to net zero if they hadn't been able to talk to colleagues over in public schools. And then educate. Every meeting, you're educating and reminding everybody that zero energy is the target. I talked to the project manager on Discovery. He said he'd given 20, 30 tours and talks and spoken to hundreds of people about the project. So it requires education all the time. And finally, when you have these successful models, work with your clients to push them into the zero energy criteria, into policies, RFPs, and codes. And the more that happens, the quicker the revolution happens. And that is all my slides.
Thanks, Michelle. Great. I love those key tips at the end there. Next, we are going to hear from Dan Ahrens. Dan, without further ado.
Terrific. Well, thanks very much. I'm really glad to be part of this important discussion at a time when the urgency to transform the built environment is so great, to transform the built environment to heal the earth and support health and wellness. The urgency has never been greater. So I'd like to reflect on how technology has evolved and how our techniques have changed. And we'll share a case study of an evolving project that's now underway. So with that, we've heard some about the technological options. And when we started in on this with net zero energy, net positive buildings, and the like, there were more options that we were studying. And what we're seeing is, and you're hearing today, is a bit of convergence around all electric heat pump driven systems. In some ways, this makes it easier to move towards solutions. And as we study and implement more buildings, it becomes easier to know what the appropriate, practical, and cost-effective solutions may be. In terms of the technique, there really are 3 clear steps. It's really quite straightforward on the building scale. We have to start with passive strategies, lowering the need for mechanical systems. Next, we supplement with high performance, low carbon systems. And then, and only then, provide renewable energy for the needed heating, cooling, and power. And here we must do what we can on site, but also be part of advocating for a green grid and something that we can both draw from and contribute to. Not least, we have to also address the people and the building use. How people use buildings, what they do and how they do it is not only the focus of the building design and configuration, but also the primary component of building performance. If nothing else, one positive from the current pandemic has been a focus on health and wellness, and especially health and wellness within buildings. And more of this I'll touch on at the end of my presentation. The power factor. Prior to the pandemic, we were focusing a lot on plug loads. As we move from conventional energy consumption depicted on the left, and here you see sort of the components of energy use, to high performance consumption depicted on the right, we know that the last component of energy to be improved is plug loads. And we're working on ways to address plug loads in our buildings. So that's kind of the new frontier. And again, the people. We need to focus not only on energy, but visual, thermal, and acoustic comfort, plus air quality. All of these aspects must be considered in making an optimal educational or work environment. And I'll share more on air quality in our case study. So let's look at that. This is the project which is under design. It's the Tobin Montessori Vassal Lane project for the City of Cambridge, Mass. Now completing schematic design. It includes 4 school programs, preschool through grade 8, in about 300,000 gross square feet of program space, 400,000 if you count the parking, which is underneath. The project has a mandate for net zero emissions, and we're targeting net zero energy and reduced embodied carbon. This is a look at an initial study for a 2.5 to 3-story building with plenty of roof for power generation. We looked at an energy use intensity target. We fixed on about 22 kilobTUs per square foot per year, which is the lowest for the city and among very respected projects, including ones that you've just seen that have targeted net zero energy. We'd love to go lower, but the building will have heavy use during the school day, evenings, weekends, and also over the summer for the preschool and community school and shared community facilities. Paramount to good design is solar orientation. It's often noted that passive solar design is really important, but in our observation, it rarely is really paid attention to enough. So this is a little study of our building, which is doggedly facing the sun. And in locating on an east-west axis as shown on the right, is reaping the benefit of, conservatively, an 8% reduction in energy use just by the siting. The actual number might actually be twice that. Now, a major challenge has been the need to preserve and enhance as much community open space as possible on site. So while the solar orientation is terrific, the building is piled up to a 4-story building. And in our climate, with our solar access, solar panels make about 66 kBTU per square foot per year. And with a target of 21 or 22, they can really only support a 3-story building with full coverage. So we're having to design our way around that. One key may be beyond the solar orientation, looking at connecting the building to the site and microclimate. Our climate in Boston is sort of like DC was 20 years ago. DC has shipped their climate up to us, thank you. And now, when we didn't used to have to, pretty much we need to air condition. But the building can be designed to minimize the amount of AC that's being used. And so here you see an image of the heart of the school designed with permeable building skin that allows us to connect to the outside and reduce air conditioning loads. The facade design is no longer just sort of about gut feelings. It's about window wall ratios, about high performance glazing, solar shading, and doing iterative daylight and energy model to optimize the facade. in addition to providing a variety of view windows as reflected here. And PV, related to power generation, we must pile on the power generation, but also must finesse the details. The PV is developed in an integrated aesthetic and analytic approach. We're developing a rooftop canopy to limit walkways, which can reduce the available area by 15%. And we're looking at this butterfly pattern that adds about 5% to the overall production as compared to a flat array. And we're evaluating adding a peak shaving battery bank for the grid connection and carbon reduction. And now we come to March. And one of the more interesting studies that we're doing is related to ventilation strategies. And the question has been, how much air must we deliver to make as safe and productive an environment as possible? No question, we'll have a dedicated outdoor air system with heat recovery and air filtration. Pre-pandemic, we were looking at adding ventilation for increased student performance. We're contemplating improving the code on code by providing 3 air changes per hour or bettering ASHRAE recommendations by 30%. Along came the pandemic, and we're looking at more ventilation to safeguard our students. And I'll be honest, when we learned that the Harvard School of Public Health Healthy Building Team suggested 4, 5, or even 6 air changes per hour, those of us thinking about energy conservation, well, we freaked out, thinking about what the impact might be for the energy regime, and also wondering just how big those ducts might be. But we looked more carefully at the recommendation. The call for clean air increases the benefit of filtration and recirculation, and we've been evaluating a hybrid air source heat pump and ground source heat pump system that incorporates local MERV 13 filtration, and this can contribute to the clean air regimen. So here you can see that recirculation and filtration can add as much as 5 air changes per hour to the dedicated outdoor air supplied, and effectively really provide ideal indoor air quality. Meanwhile, when the operation of the building is reduced back to code or code plus 30%, we actually have a more efficient system because the system is oversized for that use. So our project priorities range from high performance, low energy, and low carbon to maximizing power and interacting with the grid, and then also interacting with landscape materials, reusing rainwater and the like. So a holistic approach in addition to a net zero approach. So back over to NBI, or on to Daryl.
Thank you, Dan. That was interesting. What a difference a pandemic makes, huh? In how much? Well, in everything. Ventilation, not least. Thank you for that perspective there. I'd like to pass it over to Daryl Boyce to talk about the ASHRAE headquarters.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be part of this workshop and talk about our real world experience and sort of applying sustainable development principles in real world. So our current headquarters, we are still in, is something we have in Atlanta, Georgia, 35,000 square feet. We actually upgraded that facility and added to it in 2008 to LEED Platinum. And we were not in any particular rush to leave the building, but the Children's Hospital of Atlanta really needed our site for their expanded facilities, so they purchased it, and we went looking for a replacement. So we thought we could buy some land, build a building, we could have a building built for us, we could do a lease purchase, or we could buy an older building and make it good. And so we chose the latter, and we bought a 66,000 square foot building that had been built in the 70s, and we bought that in December of 2018. So why did we do that? Well, partly because the bulk of the buildings that are going to be around in 2050 are here today. And we really felt renovating a 1970 building to high performance net zero ready facility in a cost effective method was a good thing for ASHRAE to demonstrate. So we started off with owner project requirements. We definitely wanted to exceed the ASHRAE standard 189.1. We had a demand side target of 21.4, but we were really wanting to get to 15 kilobtu per year. And that was so that we could be net zero ready. Wanted to make sure we didn't waste any water. We wanted to make sure that whatever when we're operating it, we would have plug loads at 0.04 watts per square foot. Our current building, we had some issues with acoustics, so we wanted to really push the acoustics envelope by 3 to 5 NC versus our standard requirements. Ventilation rates 1.3 times ASHRAE 62, demand control, and daylighting for the major occupants 55% of the time. We also analyzed some certification programs and felt that any money that could be spent on achieving certification is better spent in the building. And we ended up relying on ASHRAE Building EQ as our primary evaluation program. And also LEED Existing Building was the next program that we were going to be doing once we got up and running. And then we had, we're planning to get a few of the pedals in the Living Building Challenge. So the standards we must meet or exceed are shown on this slide, but the only thing I really want to talk about is that we wanted to exceed or meet our ASHRAE Advanced Design Guide for zero energy office buildings, because that's where we were headed. Had a very aggressive schedule. In January of 2019, we hired a design team, and we need to be in by this coming October because we have to be out of the building that we sold to the hospital. So we're keeping on schedule right now, and we are on schedule to be in the building in October. So everything's good. Our construction budget is a little over $10 million, or $165 a square foot. And we had donations, and photovoltaics are not included in that budget. Yeah, but the total project budget, including purchase of property and fit up, is $20 million. And we believe we hired a good design team and got on with it. So we went from a very small site, like 2 acres to 11 acre site. We've actually moved to a much more pleasing location. We have trees, a small lake, and plenty of parking for staff and visitors. The existing structure really was precast concrete panels and floor to ceiling window units, not very efficient. But the structure, when we analyzed the building, was the frame and the structure had good bones. So we felt this was a good move for us. The site was a great location. And we did analyze the climate factors so that we could have a better understanding of whether we could use ground source energy and the amount of free cooling. We also analyzed, the building was already there, so we wanted to understand the solar impact on the building from both a daylighting point of view, photovoltaic potential, and energy use. We did actually come up with a plan to put a lot of photovoltaics on the site, a certain amount of it on the building, and then some on-grade photovoltaics. And we were capped at 250 kilowatts AC, and total cost for that is $550,000. And we believe that will meet our energy use requirements. When we analyzed the temperature around the Atlanta, Georgia area, we found that 23 to 30% of the time we could use natural ventilation for cooling. And so we are doing that. We have an all-electric building, and we did analyze the use of energy in the various aspects of the building operation. And we moved from the existing envelope using 90.1 an upgraded envelope and recommended envelope, natural ventilation, high performance, and plug load control to drive our move to a building that could be net zero. It was very important that we work on window to wall ratios. We had a number of workshops where we zeroed in on how we were going to get there, and the wall assembly R17, roof 35, window value U.4, 40% window to wall, and then one foot shading on the exterior. The infiltration number was impossible to achieve, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Give you a sense of how we use daylighting and some skylights to make sure we have natural lighting wherever possible in the building. Gives you a sense of our pictures of where we are in August in terms of the building completion. While we were in construction, before we started construction, the city of Peachtree Corners put in a nice pathway around the river, the lake, which worked for us. We were able to achieve a window to wall ratio average of 40%, 33.5 on the east and west, and 41.9 on the north and south. The existing walls, windows had a fair bit of light, but only 35% daylighting. And then we settled on short windows, 18 skylights for 57% daylighting on the upper levels. Again, we had a way of hitting our net zero energy operations. So we had to demand more from the envelope, thermally and tightness, demand more from the building occupants in terms of plug load and daylighting, utilize high efficiency systems to reduce energy demand, hydronic versus airside, and then DOAS as well, right size equipment, and provide flexible systems. So we ended up with hydronic systems to reduce energy and radiant panels, smaller modular control valves and ceiling fans versus VAV terminals, simultaneous heating and cooling with heat pumps, decouple temperature from humidity with the DOAS, and those were the primary principles. And our radiant system was really done in clouds above occupied zones, and it's only for heating and cooling the zones, and the ventilation there. It's cool and neutral temperature air delivered directly to space, not responsible for any of the temperature control. Ceiling fans were an important part of this because we felt that if we didn't have ceiling fans, we could have unusual, uncomfortable situations. And after the install of the heating fans, if we had an air conditioning failure, we could run the building up to 80% Fahrenheit, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, and still get 89% comfort. And we believe we're going to be around the 18.5 EUI target. Devil will be in the details when we actually get up and running. Rendering of our interior lobby area in the refurbished building, and also our staff common room. So how did we do? So we did exceed ASHRAE 189, and demand side energy consumption, as I said, 18.5 is where we expect to be. 11 of the 11 lead water use efficiency points. We will actually manage that, but we didn't seek the lead rating. We achieved the plug load and achieved the NC rating, 1.3 times ASHRAE for ventilation. And so that's where we are with the meeting the owner's requirements. And we learned a few lessons. First of all, understanding the local market. We decided that the radiant panel system would be good, but that wasn't usual in the local market in Atlanta, so we ended up paying a bit of a premium for that. The condition assessment, there was more plumbing system replacement, electrical and fire protection than we anticipated. Scope of the envelope improvement needed to meet EUI was very extensive, and we really needed to use the knowledge of all the people involved in this, the design and construction. We also found that we need to understand the utilities approach to on-site generation, and it limited the amount of generation we can have on the site. Strong engagement of the owners, representatives, and implementation team at design development. Importance of setting project goals in the OPR before the design team selected, and early involvement of subcontractors would have greatly improved the implementation. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Daryl. Someday I look forward to visiting the ASHRAE headquarters.
Yes, by all means. Well, you can visit online when as we open it. There'll be online tours and information on how it's operating. So
Fantastic. All right, so we do have some time left for Q&A, Connie.
Great. I just want to address the first question, which is always the most popular question we get. Yes, you will get a link today or tomorrow, probably tomorrow, to the presentation on demand, as well as a PDF of the slides. So those will be coming to you tomorrow. All right, if you all want to turn on your cameras, we can give that a try. If you're interested, we only have a few minutes, so it'll only be a couple questions. Hello, everybody. Okay.
Hello, world.
All right. So we had a quick question. Can Dan please explain again or expand on the strategy regarding increasing the ventilation? It's going to be a popular question for the next few months. Nope, you're muted. Thank you.
So I'm not sure exactly what we're asking here, but basically we were looking before pandemic at increasing by about 30% over ASHRAE, the ventilation, in order to help with student performance and health and wellness in general. The Harvard School of Public Health Healthy Buildings team is looking at ventilation. They're recommending 4 or 5, even 6 air changes per hour in order to have the healthiest possible space. And that can be from dedicated outside air, or it can be from a combination of that plus recirculated filtered air. And so we're using that option, which has I guess typical in high performance buildings, dedicated outside air, and then local air source heat pump units, which recirculate the air to adjust the temperature, but using that through filtration with MERV 13 filters to achieve a better air quality.
Great, thank you. Off-site energy generation was mentioned by NBI. Is this only recognized if it creates additionality or things like REX or PPA used to verify?
Boy, there's a lot in there. Ideally, yes. If you are trying to get to zero, then yes, the renewable energy you procure should be additional. It should have good additionality. In some cases, zero energy buildings, like not necessarily the one you see here, but we're looking at a picture of a building with solar panels on the roof. Some buildings have, by the way they've structured their contract for the panels on their own roof, have maybe unintentionally sold their RECs, which then leads to the question, did their own solar energy on their building, is that actually additional? There's somebody else claiming it as well. So it's a complicated topic, more than maybe the 2 minutes that we have remaining. But in the best case scenario, a zero energy building's renewable energy, whether it's on-site or off-site, should have good additionality. It should be additional, and the RECs should be retained or retired and or associated with that building specifically.
Awesome, thank you. And just jumped away here. We had a lot of questions, probably about 6, on electrification in cold climates. Does anybody want to touch on that?
It's a pretty broad question, but there is a lot of electrification in cold climates, particularly on the East Coast. Vermont, through Efficiency Vermont, has had active programs. At the local level, you can check out the Heat Smart program run by Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, which has a lot of information about the feasibility of electrification in cold climates, and also has done some community level campaigns. So that would be my initial 30-second response. Others?
I'll note that the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership, NEEP NEEP, has an air source heat pump, cold climate heat pump qualified products list. I'm not sure if that's exactly what they call it, but they've identified products that have both enough capability, put out enough heat at I think it's 5 degrees Fahrenheit. There are different, performance ratings, but NEEP's identified what do you need to be a creditable cold climate heat pump and still energy efficient at those levels. So there's a list there. NEEP's got some good resources on that.
I can add to that, practicing in New England, that maybe 10 years ago, 5-10 years ago, air source heat pumps had definite shortcomings in the cold weather. We had to really focus quite a bit on that and design around it and study it carefully. And what I would say is that the technology is coming along. And so that drop off where you go from a high coefficient of performance to basically a coefficient of performance of 1, where you're just doing resistance heating in that cold environment, that has dropped off in terms of the impact over the course of a New England winter. And so air source heat pump and ground source heat pump are converging a bit in terms of their performance. So the more expensive ground source heat pump has less of an advantage compared to air source. But of course, it's a systems approach. So you have to look at, are you replacing any delta with photovoltaic array or not? So that's how we're looking at it.
Great. Well, thank you. We're actually at time. Alexi, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Actually, Kevin, you still have the slides, so I'll just let you run them. I wanted to have everybody save the date. We have a date and a place for our Getting to Zero Forum in 2021, late October, the 27th through the 29th in New York City, right in the center, right, Times Square. So we'd love to see you in New York City in October 2021. Looking forward to it. It's going to be a great event. We have a ton of resources on our resource hub. It's gettingtozeroforum.org/resource hub. The Getting to Zero Forum, the event, happens once a year or so, but Getting to Zero as a movement is happening 365 days a year. So take a look at this resource hub. There's a ton of great information on there about some of the things we've talked about today and far beyond. And please join us for some more webinars coming up in just a couple weeks. We're going to be talking about getting to zero specifically in schools. We're going to be doing a presentation, Electrify for a New Tomorrow, as part of the Sustainable Buildings Week in Portland, virtual event. And then we've got one of our series of the Best of the Forum webinars, some of the ones that were kind of the greatest hits from last time around, with some updates, as you might expect, coming up in late October. So take a look at our webpage there, newbuildings.org/event, for registration links. We'd love to have you join us again. Thank you. Thank you for joining, everyone. Appreciate your time today. Thanks to all the panelists for your expertise and your contributions, and I hope today was useful. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.